We have one final session. We will make it quick because I think, yeah, we are already all very tired. But maybe many of you have many questions to ask to the panelists. Maybe you can both stay here, and I can also ask Nancy and Jenny to come here. Yeah, maybe you can just, I don't know, lean here. Very cool. I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Michela. I'm also in the YEAR board. And I'm myself also a junior researcher. And I'm doing some research on the topic of open science. And basically, yeah, probably that's why I'm leading. I'm doing the panel here, moderating the panel. Basically, the conversation is about how to avoid pitfalls when publishing open access or open research data. And it's called Fishbowl Conversation because you're all very much invited to ask the questions that you want to pose to our panelists. And maybe I will just start with one quick question that all of you can reply quickly. And then I would just say that you ask the questions that you still want to ask. Good. So basically, now I'm a young researcher and I want to be a successful competitor in the job market. So do you have some advice for me how I can really become a successful researcher while practicing open science? Maybe I'll start with you.
Okay, so I'm glad you clarified that you want to be a successful researcher because the job market's quite a large place with different things. So, yeah, I mean, I think by putting into practice all of the things that were just said, and also being clear on why you're doing what you're doing. So I think I said earlier that, you know, you can only really do open data sharing properly if you're actually willing to and going to go the full. There's no point doing half measures. And so I think just being clear about your motivations would be helpful in that regard.
I think that going open as a young researcher is going to be also an advantage since you are an early career researcher, since you want to present your job and not a lot of people know about your job. So going open, both using open routes to publishing, but also social media to start sharing your job is going to increase your impact.
So at the risk of repeating, I guess, most of what my talk was about, I'll slightly evade the question and talk about its use outside of being a researcher. And I think the simple argument again is that a lot of the skills that you build up by preparing your data to be used openly, or publishing your work so that people outside of the academic world can see it, is going to make you a lot more valuable on the jobs market outside of research, as well as inside of the research academy.
Yeah, I think if you want to be good at research, you have to get really good at doing research. But if on top you do something unique with the outputs that you have, you may have an advantage.
Thank you very much. So maybe we go on with a question from the audience. Anyone? Otherwise, I have a list of questions here. I'm very prepared. Sure.
Now, taking the risk of repeating myself, you said that you have to go all the way in. And you also mentioned that it's either staying very conservative or being very liberal about it. Is there no half measures? I mean, I'm ready to do preprints. I'm ready to advertise my work on ResearchGate. But if I start doing open notebook science, I'm out of job tomorrow.
So when I said all the way, I just meant if you decide to take one aspect of open science and do it properly, because otherwise there's no point. So if you decided to share the data, then share it in a way that it's genuinely open, as opposed to just online and not actually very useful. I mean, that's the thing, it's sharing stuff usefully is a separate point to sharing stuff openly, which essentially is a legal term, really. So Yeah, so if you do one thing, do it well, was the point I was trying to make. But I absolutely believe that you can be an open scientist without doing open notebook science. That is really much very far at the extreme end of, brilliant that people do it, and in a way that they can get away with it. So if you look at open notebook science labs, they're in quite specific fields where they both don't fall. So for instance, Open Source Malaria, who I saw tweeting earlier today about different compounds that they were making, they live tweet their experiments, they fall under the radar of companies because they're creating they're creating medicines for malaria which are not profitable. So companies don't care. They're also doing chemistry, which is not interesting to organic chemists. I don't know if anyone knows any organic chemists, but what they're interested in is creating hugely large, complex molecules from very small starting blocks. What they're not interested in doing is kind of doing standard organic syntheses that produce useful products. So they're not competing in the organic chemistry market because they're just doing useful, kind of fairly basic reactions, and they're not competing in the commercial market. So those are the kinds of people that can do it all the way, if you like, with no detrimental effects. But you just have to choose your level of what you're happy with doing. I think at a minimum, to call yourself an open scientist, really it's releasing the papers and releasing the data underlying the papers and associated methods like software that you've used to create the results. If you're putting your results out there in a way that anyone anywhere in the world can see them and reproduce them, although that's another talk in itself, then you're basically going the right way, would be my take.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope we haven't discouraged anyone today to going open, because I think open what you can. A good way maybe to start is think open by default. So if I made my research completely open, like the open notebook science, and then you would decide, okay, I can't do open notebook science because I get fired. Okay, so let's scratch it off the list. But maybe you can release some of the source code, maybe you can release the data, and surely you can release the papers. So really, all of these examples were meant as an encouragement that there are actually people out there who are doing alien things to most people, yeah. So if you present this to people in the higher ranks, they're usually completely stunned what's happening out there, because they left academia when they still had to mail in their paper to the journal.
Thank you. So my question is more like a practical one. Let's assume that you have released your preprint, like in open access or in an open repository. How do you refer to that kind of paper? I mean, if you are referring, or you would like to refer to the paper, but you can't access it, but you can access the preprint. Should you contact the author, or how would you refer to that in your own research or literature review?
Who wants to take that?
You can use this other microphone if you want.
I have one here. I don't know which one you prefer. No?
Yeah, it's basically you need to look at, there's a comment section on arXiv, and it will tell you whether the paper was pre-peer review or post-peer review. And so you have to really decide, usually when it's a post-print, then it's pretty much the version that was sent to the publisher, and then just copy editing and all that, this nice layouting follows. So you have to really judge in any case, yeah. And if it hasn't gone through peer review, probably you need to look into your community and see, if it's acceptable to cite this paper, and then maybe even mention, there's a preliminary study. It's very fresh. It has these results. Treat this with caution. So I think really labeling what kind of version you read goes a long way in that sense.
Someone else has a question? Otherwise, I can jump in.
We must have confused more people.
Okay. Ah, good.
Yes, at our institute not yet a habit of publishing open access. So let's say that our institute would like to start getting publishing open access. What's actually the best way to start up an own self-archive? Is it repository or publish on already available ones?
Okay, so I'm not sure if, okay, there we go. So I think there will be lots of good resources online about this, and you'll essentially need to, it will be different on an institution by institution basis, and what's realistic for your institution to look at. You know, if you're at a very, very rich institution, then you can think about paying for all of the APCs and the article processing charges to publish in an open access journal. If that's what you want to do, there are lots of options for publishing open access that don't involve paying, and there's always the self-archiving route, which is good if you don't, have bags and bags of money. I think the first step at an institution is just to start to talk to people about it. So, for instance, if you were interested in taking this forwards, I'd start to speak to librarians, I'd start to speak to your faculty and fellow researchers about it, and start to get interest in the topic. And then normally, from there, you'll have to explore kind of, again, what's right for your institution. They're all structured differently, but often trying to get some sort of policy in place that represents the faculty and the graduates, sometimes the students, in place is a really good move, because that lays out what the institution expects from its the people inside of it. And then from there, hopefully during that process, which will normally involve some consultation, you'll have figured out kind of what is the right place for your institution to the right way for your institution to go open access, essentially. Does that generally answer your question?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
More or less. It's a complex, point.
Are you going to hold this for me? Thank you very much. Generally speaking, don't expect that you are going to start talking to people and people are going to be excited. And they will say, yeah, of course, let's do it. I don't know about it a lot, and maybe my career is going to be in trouble, but yeah, come on, let's do it. And when you start doing the advocacy, you need to contact the right people in the institution. And the right people, it really depends on the environment of the institution. But generally speaking, it should be either people who are doing it already and they have a very good experience from it, or it is depending, there are different words depending on where you are located in the world, but head of departments, deans, research offices, and the key stakeholders who drive the forces behind the research conduction, and also what counts as being valuable within the institution. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe also a good thing is to find role models, so institutions that are already doing it that's very similar to your institution, because that often goes a long way if you, I don't know, cite Max Planck, for example. Yeah, there are many institutions out there who would like to be Max Planck, so, well, maybe there's one way to get closer to that.
And just on the more technical side, I mean, to start off with, just pointing people towards repositories that deal disciplinary repositories would be a good start. In terms of institutional repositories, there is some open source software available for institutional repositories. I'm not an expert on that, but I know there are different options. I also know that a lot of institutions have spent an awful lot of money creating their own custom ones, which are not much better. So I'd probably, if you're looking more on the kind of practically how you implement a repository in an institution, I'd caution against rushing straight into making your own and see what's already available and what's been tried and tested. Because I know even Oxford spent a hell of a lot of money on creating a data repository that, as far as I can tell, is no better than other ones that I've seen that are open source and available. So that's one, just a small technical, practical point to bear in mind. Yeah.
Other more questions from the audience? Otherwise, I would like to ask, because you convinced me, I would really much like to practice open science. But unfortunately, I am in a project where we plan to patent our research output. So is there a chance for me still to practice open science in this context?
To kick off. I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to ask for the question earlier to be repeated that I didn't get a chance to answer. So for people who don't have a background in intellectual property law, which includes me, but I've learned a bit of it about it over the years, it's important to understand the distinction between patenting an idea, which is an abstract concept, an idea for an invention, and patent and copywriting a creative expression of an idea. So all of the stuff that we've been talking about today has absolutely zero to do with patents. Other than if you do release some data, which it might give someone an idea of something that they could patent. And so some people are reluctant to put data out there because they worry that, you know, someone will pick up an idea that they haven't already. If you've already published a paper, at that stage, you'll have done the patent application already, usually, because that's how it works. Well, okay, someone's shaking their head, but the idea embedded in the paper is no longer patentable if you publish the idea. That's the whole point of patents.
It's unpatentable for yourself as well, right?
Yeah, so you should already have done, so most companies before they publish go through the patent, this is what I mean. So you go through the patent process, you protect your idea, and then at the point of writing the paper, you creatively express that idea, and that creative expression is covered by copyright. And all of the stuff we've discussed today, so the open access publication is just at that stage making something available. So there's a big separation between patenting and the whole commercial aspect of it, and the copyright that only protects that actual paper. I could take your patent and write a new paper based on that patent, and I wouldn't be breaking any copyright laws. I wouldn't really even be breaking the patent because I haven't actually used it. I've just written about it. So do people understand that? Have I explained it well enough that you get the distinction? So by making your paper open access, you're not putting your ideas out there for anyone to use and commercialize. It's an entirely different section of law that controls that. With data, it can sometimes be a bit more iffy. But it depends like what actually your patent would cover. And so if it's something like data modeling and that sort of stuff, you do have to be a little bit more careful. But again, if you've published the paper on a set of data, and there's always going to be fringe cases, then usually you should be fine to publish the data openly, the paper openly, still retain that patent and still be able to commercialize your research if that's what you want to do. They're not in conflict with each other, at least not at the level we've discussed. So there are people, so open science is like a massive term that covers a whole bunch of stuff. And some people are interested in essentially pushing back the boundary of when you make something patented. So having IP-free distribution of things like software, of things like hardware. I work on IP-free distribution of biological reagents and DNA parts that you can put together to make kind of make cells do cool things. But that's a sort of entirely separate area to anything that we've discussed today, really. Did you want to come back to me on anything?
Just goes back to the definition. So definition of open science, if you're talking about data sets that are related to a published paper, then that is the case. But if we're talking about open notebook science, then you will screw up your patents.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But the point is there's no conflict. If you are planning to commercialize, you can be open at a certain level, and then of course you can be open beyond that. And you know, open science also extends, the definition also extends to open participation in the process of doing science, and these far, far more nebulous concepts, which are amazing and lots of fun. But there's actually all the stuff we've discussed today is pretty concrete in terms of you're just, you know, producing a research output and licensing it openly is at a legal level the easiest thing you can possibly do. And then once you start getting into more the way that we want to change the culture of science and how science is communicated, then it obviously gets a little bit more soft and I think a lot of fun. But that, you know, it doesn't conflict with making money at the basic level. I hope that answers your question at the back as well. Does it? A little bit?
Okay, good. Then it's my turn again. How to say? I would very much like, I like this open notebook science approach, and I would like to blog more about, I don't know, interim results and thoughts that I have during my research process, much earlier before I even thinking of publishing anything. But the thing is that I don't really have much time next to my usual research workflow that I'm in to really do this kind of stuff. Maybe you have some tips or something how I can reorganize myself to be able to do that still. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I've heard many people saying, and by people I mean those who work in research offices and they help academics to write proposals, but they also help academics to make the public aware of the research impact, is that if you are about to work on 4 different projects, try to work on 3 and spend the time that you would have working on the 4th, just trying to advertise your research and try to show to people what is this that you've been doing, and try to raise your profile to the rest of the research community, and then expand this profile not only to the research community but also to the people who may be using your research in their everyday lives, not researchers, just the public.
Yeah, I mean it's in some ways a really easy question to answer, but also a really hard question to answer. I mean, time is a limited resource for everyone, and in some ways the answer to that question is a lot of mumbo jumbo about kind of getting stuff done and just being organized. But I realize that's not a very useful question answer even. I think I would kind of build on what you've just said and say that science communication is increasingly seen as a core aspect of actually doing the work, right? There's sayings along the lines of science not seen as science not done. That there's very little impact your work can have. There's very little point in you doing that research then if no one sees it. So changing the mindset around the only valuable thing I do as a scientist is sit by my bench and pipette small amounts of liquid from one tube to another is a crucial mindset change that I think needs to happen as a part of this. And then it becomes easier to go, okay, I should sit down for an hour and a half and write what I'm thinking about this piece of research, or write about a paper I just saw. And suddenly that becomes something that is seen as integral to what you're doing and not a waste of time, right? I do appreciate that for many people that's a hard case to make at the moment, but it's where things are going. Yeah.
I just want to add in one thing, that the research impact is something that funders really care a lot. The new ref policy in the UK talks about research impact, and it talks also about societal research impact. And the societal research impact, it's also something that it's embedded in the Horizon 2020 guidelines, because I don't want to call them rules. So it's something that young researchers need to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would like to add one point. You can negotiate your work even as a PhD student. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to negotiate everything with your supervisor, but if you think that there are really useless things that you need to do, you may be able to get them away, especially if you have good arguments. If you show your supervisor that the poster that you just published got 1,000 views, he might or she might want to reconsider some of the other stuff that they make you do, which doesn't have an impact on anyone, anywhere.
There's just a question regarding green and gold access. Okay, I know for one you have to pay, for the other one is free, but what has actually the largest impact? I mean, if somebody goes on Google to search for certain information, will he first see the green articles or first the gold articles? I mean, which has the largest effect on the community? Is it worthwhile paying for the gold access?
So the thing that I would probably start with is that gold open access or journal-mediated open access doesn't have to cost a huge amount of money. It can be very, very expensive if you choose to publish with some of the more traditional publishers, but it can also be extremely inexpensive, ranging, from $100, a few $100, which is much easier to cover, or it can be free. Some of those free journals, granted, aren't fantastic, but some of them are. and so really looking around and not just assuming that you have to pay is something that's worth doing, and the place to do that is in the directory of open access journals. I won't give the URL, it's pretty easy to Google. In terms of the kind of viewership for each count, it can be significant for each. I think in most cases the journal version of the article would come up on top, but the green version, or the version in a repository or in an institutional subject repository, often isn't far behind. And if someone is looking at a paywalled version of your article, the green version is the next place to go, right? And search engines will often bring that up, although in many cases it's not optimized as heavily as it could be. So, and ways to help fix that is to link to green versions of your work as an author, rather than the published version, because that will push it a little bit higher. But now I'm getting into search engine optimization, which is I don't want to be one of those spam email guys that comes up in your inbox. Anyone else?
I just want to add one thing about published versions, and in general about versions, and in general about what we're saying. A lot of the things that we say today is about publishing habits, and we need to shift the publishing habits, and this is not easy. When I was working on my dissertation, I interviewed authors. It was NIH-funded authors. NIH is the equivalent of the national health system in every country. NIH is in the US. And I interviewed them, and we were talking about versions. And they were saying, I like the publisher's PDF because it's like a house that has been painted. To me, this is, if the same information appears in a postprint, which is just a Word document with no images, no page setting, nothing, and the house that has been painted, to me, if the information is the same, it's just a psychological thing. It's just like a habit, something that you are used to seeing. So it's a very small thing that we can easily overlook, provided the information is the same, and follow the postprint instead of the published version that we may have to pay also to access it.
I'll pass to you afterwards. So just two very small points, because it's mostly been covered, but the thing with green is to make sure that if you are choosing to take that route, that you ensure it's put somewhere that's indexed, like a repository, because just putting it on a website, which often happens, is not so good. Google's good, but it's not fantastic. And if you can get it somewhere that outputs data to other repositories, I mean, Core, we had a presentation on earlier, does that. That's really important. And secondly, so one thing that gold does do is it's far more likely, or this not is always true, to be machine readable and accessible by a machine. So if anyone's doing text and data mining type projects, they're far more likely to be able to get hold of gold than they are green currently, although that's partly a result of some of the indexing on green not being great, and because you get a variety of different file formats. Saying that, so I work on a text and data mining project, and we've sometimes found that repository copies of documents, because they're just a Word document or a kind of a less formatted document, are far easier for a machine to parse than a publisher's copy, where they've basically taken things that were never supposed to be images and made them images, or they've messed up the coding of the words and that sort of stuff. So little things like we came across a plus-minus symbol in a publisher copy that was actually an underlined plus, which to the human eye makes no difference. To a machine, it's expecting a Unicode plus minus, and it just completely throws the meaning of the document. So just to point out that from a machine perspective, how you're publishing can make a difference, and it brings a whole new set of considerations that just never existed before digital publication, and were certainly less of a consideration when everything was going through traditional publishing houses. So.
Yeah, coming back probably to the green versus gold thing. So I think you should aim for gold, but if there are many reasons why you can't go gold all the time, then you should aim for green. Yeah, to do what you can. I think that's the most important message that I would like to put out there. And also be sure that if someone Googles your paper, they find any version of your paper, because otherwise, and that I know that from interviews with lots and lots and lots of scientists, you just don't exist. Yeah, and it shouldn't be a criteria, but that's what many people say. I will cite the paper that I can access. So make sure that there's a copy out there that others can see.
Okay, there is room for one final question. Does anyone want to take that? Otherwise, I will pose one final question, which is a more practical question again. Because I was looking into possibilities to publish my paper in an open access journal or a repository. But I don't really have an idea how to find the relevant journals for my specific research field. Maybe you have some guidelines how I can manage that.
Yeah, so this has become a mess. I mentioned the way to find open access journals, which is the directory of open access journals will list every journal that is really that is truly open access and that you should consider publishing in. If it's not in there, then you should probably look into it quite deeply. That's a good first step. You should also kind of do your own checks around the journal. You should, in the same way that you would if you were going to buy anything online, you should look at the website. You should make sure that it kind of looks, reasonable. You should, ask your colleagues and see if that's a journal which they're familiar with. If it's something you've read stuff in there, you should read other papers and make sure that that journal is applicable for your field. There's lots of, concerns that you should have when you're publishing in any journal. You should make sure that it's a journal that you're interested in, not just whether it's obviously it turns up in the directory of open access journals. So I think when you're looking at journals, that's the kind of general workflow that you should follow. If you want to find repositories in your area or institutional repositories, you can ask at your library again for your institution, or you can look at the directory of open access repositories, DORA, right? Not DORA. Yes, DORA. Open Door. Yeah. Acronyms. Which lists, again, like essentially every institutional repository in the world, and then are subject repositories kept in that list as well? They're not. So subject repositories aren't actually listed quite as well. Do you know where they are?
In Open Door. Yes.
Okay.
Because in the search engine, it has a subject area, and then you can search by subject.
Okay, I've never had that. Okay, apparently Open Door is just the place to go for repositories. But again, speak to people in your field and find out where they're looking. We spoke a number of times about going where the community is. So it's important to go and ask the community where they're looking at stuff, right? For physics, there's really only one place to go. That's archive. In biology, you might want to look into bioarchive or things like that. Sometimes there is, the one place where you should go. And in some cases, there's several. And it may depend on many factors. Right, sure.
One thing that I would like to add, if you don't know which journal, you can ask if you're a student, your supervisor. You can ask your classmates or people that you are like in your PhD group. And if all these people don't know, find online the people you admire and then look where they have published, and maybe one of their lists is an open access journal. If there isn't an open access journal in your field, and there are chances that there may not be, then it's a good chance that you start your own open access journal, that it's going to be prestigious and it's going to have a high impact at some point. See, to keep you busy.
Great. That was a great closing word, I think. Thank you very much for answering all our questions. Thank you very much for the great training sessions. I think this was a very great and productive day. Thanks also to the two speakers who are already gone, but their presentations were also very interesting, very great. Thanks to you all. who were very active today and also very attentive. I hope that you also profited from this event. And I mean, tomorrow it will continue with the workshop. Yeah, and of course, this evening we have the social dinner. I remind you again that at 6:30 p.m. we will meet downstairs in the lobby in the Hotel Helka to go together to the restaurant. And yeah, is there anything else that I should mention now?
Maybe just a small detail. So yeah, tomorrow for those who present the project ID, remember to bring your PC, because if you get pre-selected and you need to work in team, it might be nice to work on your own PC, and at least to be sure there is one PC in the team available. No, otherwise I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.